From the magnificent Midwest, it's the Suzanne Venker Show, where men and women are equal in value but wildly different by nature. Join us here every week when we have unfiltered conversations about love and marriage, work and family, and everything in between. If you need some confirmation, some affirmation, or some inspiration, you have landed in the right place. This podcast is all about exposing the false cultural narratives that are undermining your ability to be successful in love. So today we're going to discuss why knowing how to handle conflict is a must in order for your relationship to thrive. But first, a few quick announcements. First of all, I wanted to thank you all for bearing with me as I get going again here with the podcast. Since I last recorded, my husband Bill had 2 minor surgeries. Our daughter graduated from college, and wait for it, I got COVID. So I have been down for the count for several weeks, and I've been so frustrated about not being able to get in front of this microphone for you all, but I can finally say that I am back in action. So once again, thank you for your patience. I also have some super exciting news. My podcast producer, Kelsey, who you've heard me all talk about, is pregnant. If you've been following me for some time, you know about Kelsey. She's even been on the program once or twice. And she and her drummer husband, whose name is Andres, he's from Colombia, moved to Nashville from Florida about 1.5 years ago, and they got settled there and are now going to be parents. And I am over the moon for them and know they're going to be great parents. So just a shout out to them. Next, if you'd like to become a subscriber to the Suzanne Venker Show and get all the free goodies that come along with that, including free ebooks and an advanced release of this podcast, don't forget to go to SuzanneVenker.com/podcast. You can even pause this program and go do that right now, and we'll be waiting here when you finish. Finally, for those of you who may not know, we have a Facebook fan page for listeners of the Suzanne Venker Show. So if you'd like to commiserate with other listeners, you can do that by joining our group on Facebook. Just type in the Suzanne Venker Show private group, and it should come right up. And now on with the show. So I want to talk about a very sensitive but critical subject, and that's marital conflict or relationship conflict in general. There isn't a person on this planet who can avoid relationship conflict. Unless, of course, you remain single. That's always an option. In fact, if you're someone who hates confrontation, you're going to struggle to be in a marriage or a relationship at all. Until or unless you learn how to embrace conflict. Because no matter how warm and fuzzy you feel about someone, when you first get together, when you first are dating, or when you first are even married, there will come a day when you see things you didn't see before. There will come a day, many days actually, when life throws you curveballs. And these curveballs will almost certainly change the dynamic between you and your spouse and force upon you hard conversations. And if you're already married and you hate conflict, the very best thing you can do for your relationship starting today is to learn how to embrace it. That's why I'm taking the time for this today. I think this is crucial to survival, and we do not talk enough about it, at least not openly. Maybe behind closed doors in a counselor's office, but and certainly I deal with it with coaching, but I think we needed a podcast on it. So there was a great study a few years ago, and I'll have the link to that study in the show notes for you, which found that couples who argue effectively are 10 times more likely to have a happy relationship than those who sweep difficult issues under the rug. This shouldn't be that surprising because the opposite of dealing with conflict or of facing a problem and talking about it is obviously avoidance, not talking about it, not addressing the elephant in the room. And this is the biggest mistake a couple can make. Because what ends up happening is that one or both partners are thinking and feeling things, but they're saying nothing until he or she can't stand it anymore. Over time, obviously, this breaks down trust and intimacy, and the relationship invariably fails. That doesn't necessarily mean divorce. There are plenty of couples who stay together in this very unhealthy state, but at the end of the day, the relationship isn't functioning or working if you're just simply avoiding everything. So the question is, how do we embrace conflict so that our marriages and relationships can thrive? Begin by understanding the critical nature of truth, or the ability to say exactly what you're thinking to your partner, even if it hurts, even if it scares you. In fact, the more it hurts and the more it scares you, the more that means you need to address it. Of course, we all know people who avoid hard conversations. Maybe you're even one of them. But it's a very dangerous thing to do, because not addressing the problem or pretending it isn't there does not make it go away. I think that's a really interesting fact, because people know this, right? Everyone knows this. There's no rocket science to that. And yet they'll still not address it anyway in the hopes that it will go away. But of course it doesn't. In fact, every time you sweep something under the rug, you're making your relationship incrementally worse by the day. Let me say that again. Every time you sweep something under the rug or just keep quiet, you're making your relationship incrementally worse by the day. If you know and accept this to be true, and I hope you do, then your only recourse is to get comfortable with hard conversations. I don't know that this is too much of a gender issue, although I do think that in general, women are more open to talking about things than men are. Women are certainly more attuned to the nuances of a relationship than men are. We know that. But from what I've seen, both sexes can struggle in this way for a whole host of reasons, mostly having to do with what they absorbed growing up. How parents handle conflict will almost always be passed on to their kids. And their kids often repeat the pattern in their own marriages and relationships. Maybe your parents fought all the time with no resolutions. Maybe they were nasty when they fought and called each other names. Maybe your parents never fought at all, but you could cut the tension with a knife. Maybe your parents didn't live together, and then you really don't see anything. Or maybe they both worked all the time, so you just never get to see enough of an interaction between them to glean any wisdom about how to handle conflict. Whatever your story, it doesn't have to be this way in your marriage. But it does take constant vigilance and mindfulness to change the pattern, because it isn't natural to you. It wasn't modeled for you, so you're basically just winging it through trial and error. I'm going to give you an example now from my own marriage. So I think I've mentioned before that my husband Bill is a product of divorce. And the way he always described it to me was that his parents, both of them, they both were similar in this way, personality-wise. And that was, they weren't addressing anything. They didn't talk about anything. They didn't address it. The elephant in the room. So there was, what's the result of that? Like I said, if you're not addressing it, you're avoiding it. So when you're avoiding it, you're essentially feeling things and saying nothing. And like I said, over time, that's just going to build. That's a no-win situation. And so he never heard fighting or conflict. But of course, if you go back to what I was describing as a possibility earlier, they could certainly cut the tension with a knife. You know it's there. But what do you do with those feelings? What do you do with that stuff that's going? You feel it, you see it in the air, but you don't see any resolution, and you don't see any just addressing it, period. So it's like walking on eggshells. And then boom, all of a sudden, one day he learns his parents are getting divorced. So then you compare that to my parents, who it was the opposite of avoidance, very, very open. Everything was sort of there on the table, but it was destructive conflict, which is clearly no better. I'm not going to get into the details of how this played out. I will only say that my husband and I not wanting to repeat our parents' marriages has played a key role in our commitment to dealing with conflict. We're no different from any other couple in terms of our not having had good role modeling. We just don't want to get it wrong. And sometimes that can be enough to keep you going until you feel like you have it down, if you're willing to do that. The reality is healthy people don't enjoy conflict. No one does. But many people give up because they don't know how to handle it and they don't want to deal with all those bad feelings. So some of you may remember a book I've recommended called Know Yourself, Know Your Money by Rachel Cruz. She's Dave Ramsey's daughter. So the focus of that book is money, but I like how she talks about our childhood money classrooms, where she asks you to determine which quadrant you're in. So she's got this quadrant. I'm sure you've seen quadrants before. And she compares open conversations versus closed and calm conversations versus stressed. And there's more to it than that. She talks about anxious, stable, whatever. But the gist of it is determining what you gleaned growing up in terms of how your parents communicated or dealt with conflict is crucial to like figuring out where you want to get, because there's a place on the quadrant where you want to be, stable and positive. Even though the focus of that book is on money, it's really about how your parents dealt with conflict in general. And obviously money is a huge part of that. So it doesn't matter whether you're referring to money or something else. It's just how was conflict dealt with. So going back to what I was saying about my husband, Bill, and me, as far as our upbringings go, his parents were closed. The environment was closed. Nothing was talked about, but it was also calm. Mine was open, but stressed. So you hear the words like open and calm, and you think those are good things, but not if they're combined with the other one. So yeah, it's good that his environment was calm, but not when it's closed, because then, as I said, that's just avoidance. And eventually it implodes. Mine was open, which is good, but it was stressed, which is not good. So obviously you want the goal to be open and calm. I like to compare having these hard conversations with your spouse to working out at the gym. You have to endure the pain first to get the payoff later. So in the same way, you may not feel like working out, which, is probably most of the time. You do it anyway because you know how you're going to feel in an hour. And you got to really stay focused on, okay, I'm going to feel this way in an hour. It's awesome. So I'm going to endure this temporary pain. It's pretty much the same thing with marital conflict, or really any conflict of any kind. Only it will probably last more than an hour depending on the subject, or it could last more than an hour. Although if you're constantly addressing things, it shouldn't be so time consuming. If you're building them up over a long period of time, it could take an entire day. But the payoff of just addressing the conflict, even if it doesn't go well, is still better than not addressing it at all. Of course, the goal is for it to go well, so I'm going to talk about how to argue effectively with your spouse in just a moment. But first, I want to go back to this concept of truth. The author Joseph Grenny, who wrote a book called Crucial Conversations, said this, quote, "The success of a relationship is determined by the way in which sensitive issues are debated. Real love is not just about love, but about truth." End quote. That's where I think people get into so much trouble in their relationships. Because again, to not address the truth is to avoid it. And avoiding it will lead to things like, for example, passive aggressiveness, which is a hugely destructive behavior pattern. To be passive aggressive essentially means making subtle digs at your partner for things you've been too afraid to say out loud. If you find yourself or your partner doing that, it needs to be called out for what it is, because that's on the person who's being passive aggressive, not on the receiver of that, or the person who isn't. You're basically lacking the courage to tell the truth. And so you're building up all this junk in your head, and then you're coming out with these digs, these subtle digs, or even if they're not digs, subtle comments that the other person's like, wait, what was that all about? Because you haven't addressed the elephant in the room. A healthy couple welcomes conflict. And when you walk into the discomfort, just like with working out, you succeed. The pain of it all will be temporary, but the rewards will be great. If you recall, on the last episode, I talked about how so many millennials don't talk about finances because they say they know it will lead to a fight. So they're screwed. People who their marriages are ticking time bombs. All they're doing is postponing the inevitable, because the conflict doesn't disappear just because you don't talk about it. It's like trying to push a ball under the water. It's going to come right back up every single time. So the question is, how do you have hard conversations when you're married or in a relationship? How can you effectively argue with your spouse? And keep in mind, I'm referring here to anything at all in your marriage that either one or both of you knows is a problem. It could be about sex, or an addiction, or something more benign like household chores, or parenting, that's a big one, or employment status, or money management, that's huge, obviously. Literally anything that's causing tension in your marriage has to be on the table. So I'm going to list now 6 things that I know from firsthand experience work. So you might want to grab a pen to write these down. Ready? Number 1. Start with something positive. Ideally, you'd want to say something that's positive about the other person first, before anything else comes out of your mouth. But if not, then focus on the positive result that you want for the relationship, not what the other person did or is doing. I mean, presumably the other person wants the same result. If you both don't want the same result, that's a harder conversation, because you're going to have to determine that first and get on the same page. But assuming you both want to be happily married, then that's what you want to focus on. You're not saying what you're saying to be mean, but to get to a better place. And if you start with something, most people, unless you are saying it to be mean, and then you have another problem on your hands, but most people aren't doing that. They want to fix something, right? And if you start with something positive, the other person will probably not go into defense mode, which is all too common in relationship conflict. I'm going to be giving you all some resources here at the end too, so make sure you stay tuned for that. Being defensive is a natural human reaction when you hear something that somebody is unhappy with about, presumably you. But staying focused on the relationship and that's your goal, rather than the person being bad or wrong or inept in some way, is really important. So if you start with something positive, you immediately break down their defenses because they've heard something positive first. I mean, I guess you could call this positive psychology, but it really does work. Number 2, focus on how things make you feel rather than on what the other person did wrong. So for example, when you do something differently than you said you would do, when you told me you would do, it feels like I don't matter to you. That's an example. I think that's a big one for people. This is especially true if you're the type of person who does exactly what you say you'll do. This type of person would rather have a spouse say no to them than to say they'll do something and then not do it. And I know for a fact this tends to be a gender thing, because I see it both in my personal life and in coaching. Men really struggle to say no to their wives. I'm going to be talking about this in an episode next week that's exclusively for men. It's very difficult for men to say no. It's unnatural for them to say no to the woman they love. It's just not human nature for him to want to do that. So what happens is, very often a man will say yes, he'll do something to make her happy in that moment, but then not follow through. And that is not the way to do things. How else can I say that? It's better for you to say, no, I can't do that. Or no, I can't do that at this time, but I can do it at this time or whatever. But being very clear in what you will and won't do, rather than to say something and then do something else. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I'm going to be talking about this big time next week. That's just an example. Focusing on how something makes you feel rather than what they did. When you do something differently than you said you would do, it feels like I don't matter to you. Or another example, this is a little heavier, a lot heavier. When you drink too much, and this is definitely not a gender thing, our conversations go south and our sex life suffers. It feels like you're choosing alcohol over us. So addictions of any kind are going to be an especially difficult conversation. And for some couples, it's an ongoing conversation that seems to never end. And it's very difficult. The weight of that problem rests with the person who has the addiction. The other person just feels helpless because he or she has no control or feels like they have no options other than to leave. But if you have kids, that doesn't feel like an option. But again, you're going to focus on not what the person is doing, but on how that makes you feel, how the behavior makes you feel, because no one can argue with that. The other person cannot argue with your feelings. When you focus on what a person does, you risk their defending themselves. So if you come out with, these you statements and you, I can't take this anymore. You've got to, versus if you're calm and focusing on what it's doing to you, they can't get defensive about that because it's not really about them. It's about you and how you're feeling, and no one can take that away from you. So it starts the whole conversation in a different direction. Okay, so number one, start with something positive. Number two, focus on how things make you feel rather than what the other person is doing. Number three, don't interrupt when you're having this hard conversation, when you're having these hard conversations. Another way of saying that is just to listen better, be a better listener. Don't be so quick to fill in the silences. Let there be silence, because this leaves space for the other person to think. In fact, the quieter you are during the conversation, the more effective the conversation will be, because it allows the other person to work out his or her thoughts. Plus, they don't feel attacked. So I got to be honest with you. This is something my husband, Bill, and I are horrible with, that we are only now getting a handle on. Mainly because we both have very strong personalities and we feel things very deeply. So we're just really bad at not interrupting. It's almost like our bodies take over our minds, and we're speaking before we mean to speak. And I mean, I think everybody deals with this when things are heated and you're having a really hard conversation. But just as a general rule, he and I are both this way, and it's really bad. And fortunately, we recognize that in ourselves, and we're both working on it actively and 1,000 times better than we used to. And I've learned some tips to help with that I'm going to mention at the end here in number 6. So number 3, don't interrupt. Listen more. Let the silence be silent and give the other person a chance to think, because the less you're talking, the more they can think. And obviously the opposite is true. The more you're talking, the more they just feel attacked at every moment. And there's no space there. Number 4, repeat back what you heard the other person say before you respond. So what I heard you say was, and then you repeat it. I know that sounds really psychobabbly, and I actually hate psychobabble, but this actually works, because it ensures not only that the other person was heard, which is super important, but that you respond to the right thing and don't end up going down some other road. And wait, let me say that again. And don't end up going down some other road that gets you away from solving the problem at hand. This is super common in heated conversations, that you ever feel that way, where you're just like, you're talking about it and you're on the road and you're getting somewhere, and then something gets misconstrued. Next thing you know, you're talking about something else entirely, and the original thing never gets resolved because you're somewhere else. And that's super frustrating and awful because you feel like, why did I have this conversation at all? So repeat back what you heard them say before you respond. Don't just respond right away when the other person's after the other person has spoken. Repeat what they've said. They feel heard, and then you're really, really clear about what you're about to address. And you can get to the issue more easily than if you don't. So that's a big one. Well, these are all big, actually, in my opinion. Number 5, choose your timing well. Oh my gosh, this is going to be really hard for some of you. Well, it certainly has been for us. Do not engage in any hard conversation if you're sleep deprived, hungover, stressed out about something else or anything, or if there are little ones present, because you're going to get distracted and the conversation will go nowhere. So I know this is, now that my husband and I are empty nesters, this will become clear when you become empty nesters. When you have kids at home, I mean, we're past that point, obviously, but I know all too well how challenging it is to address problems or issues in one's relationship when you have kids in your midst. In fact, I honestly think that's where things tend to go wrong with marriages, because prior to having kids, you have all the time and the space in the world to address anything you want. But kids are a constant distraction. They take you away from having to address what you need to address in your marriage. This is what I meant when I said you have to be constantly vigilant, or these conversations will get away from you. And the next thing you know, your relationship is in crisis mode from all that silence. So it's so much easier now with our kids out of the house to deal with whatever we have to deal with. When you have kids at home, you have to be strategic and, as I said, vigilant. And it's really easy to just let the thing go because you've got the immediate needs of the kids. I think this is just massive and major in most marriages. I think this is where, honestly, marriages go wrong, and why you end up with a lot of gray divorce, where boomers are, breaking up after their kids move away. And I can see how that would happen now that I'm in, like I said, now that we're empty nesters, I see how much more and how much easier it is for us to address things. And fortunately, because Bill and I have been so committed to not ending up like our parents, we didn't live that way where we just avoided things. That's just not how we did it. But I can see how couples who did do that then end up with nothing when their kids leave home. I can totally see that. It makes perfect sense. This is why I'm having this conversation, that conflict is so hard for people and so scary, but the opposite is not an option, because it will not work. You will avoid everything and end up divorced or just in a really unhealthy relationship. So for the last one, number 6, I'm just going to give you some small tips, a handful of things that have worked for me and that I believe will work for you. Some of them, like this first one I'm going to say, has to go back to that non-interrupting that I said I struggle with and my husband struggles with. And this has been really huge. Okay. Number 1, take super deep breaths during the conversation, during the conflict. I think everybody can relate to the fact that what's happening with these hard conversations is that people are very emotional. They're very heated. They feel, I don't think it's unusual that my husband and I, for example, feel really strongly. I suspect most people do when you're dealing with something really tender. And you have to be really mindful of what's happening with your body. This is sort of a meditational thing, I guess, but it really works. Take super deep breaths in through the nose, out through the mouth several times during the course of the conversation, and you'd be amazed at how helpful that is. It's sort of like going back to what I was saying before about pausing before speaking and listening more, and letting that space do its thing. We have to be aware of what's happening in our bodies when, the physical aspect of it when we're in conflict versus when we're happy and peaceful. When you're happy and peaceful and everything's great, you don't have any tension in your body. But the moment you even think about a difficult topic, you physically feel it. And it's your job, both partners, both sexes, it's your job to get in control of your own emotions. It's not the other person's job. You're responsible for that. So one way to do that is to take really deep breaths. Another thing, if you're an interrupter, or if you really want to focus on what's being said and not get distracted, put your head down when the other person's talking if you need to. I'm a visual person, so I get easily distracted with what I see or hear around me. So if I close my eyes or if I put my head down, I can really absorb what my husband is saying without, even not looking at his not looking at his face can be helpful because you're just so focused on the words when you close your eyes or put your head down. I used to do this when I had to stop myself from telling him how to drive, which I did for many years, and I haven't for many years, I'm proud to say. But I had to do it by closing my eyes or turning to the toward the window so I don't look at what's happening. And eventually it worked. And so this is mindfulness. This is really being in touch with your body and how to use it to help with the communication. Another one is to pause before responding. Just when the person speaks and you notice you're getting upset, take that deep breath and count to 5 and then answer. And I guarantee you what you say will come out differently if you do that. And finally, leave for a moment if you have to, if it's that heated and your body is just overwhelming you. But always come back within 5 minutes and announce that you're going to do that so the other person knows you'll be right back. Otherwise, they'll think the conversation's over, so you don't want to do that. So take super deep breaths during the conflict. Put your head down if you need to, or close your eyes while the other person's talking. Pause before responding. Wait at least 5 seconds. Leave for a moment if you have to, if it's that bad. These are little tips that have worked for us that I really hope work for you. I know they work. So try them. I'm going to say it again. There isn't any one of us who's immune to dealing with a relationship conflict. No one gets a pass. But regardless of what you witnessed growing up, you do not have to repeat bad patterns. The most important thing to remember is that avoiding conflict is not the answer. You have to be able to say what's on your mind, and you have to be a person who can hear what the other person has to say, even when it's uncomfortable. You have to be open and willing to receive what you may perceive as criticism, but more often than not, it's just your spouse trying to get closer to you, to share his or her concerns for a good purpose, a good goal, which is to have a healthier and more intimate relationship. And that will often start with your willingness to hear constructive criticism. When someone can't receive that information, or if the person offering it does a poor job of delivering it, which is another problem, problems don't get resolved. So that's ultimately the goal. Being able to hear hard things and being able to deliver the message well. So to that end, I'm going to recommend Warren Farrell's new course. Some of you may have heard of him. He's a friend of mine. I talked with him on this show on episode 71, if you want to hear that. His new course is called Rollmate to Soulmate. I'm going to have a link to this in the show notes. And his slogan is that falling in love is biologically natural, but sustaining love is biologically unnatural. I happen to completely agree with that. None of us are born knowing how to do this stuff. We need skills. And Warren happens to have been conducting couples workshops for 30 years, and he's now distilled all that into this new course. The course technically started last week, but if you sign up now, you will receive the recording of the first session. Plus, once you've bought the course, you'll have it forever. So I'm not getting anything from telling you about this. I just happen to be on his list, and I've been reading about the course for a while. So I thought, since it literally has to do with exactly what I'm talking about here, I would just pass you on to him. And as always, you can still sign up for coaching with me if you prefer, or in addition to, by going to SuzanneVenker.com/coaching. And that wraps up today's episode. Please share this podcast with at least one friend or family member you think would enjoy it, and don't forget to leave us a review on whatever platform you're now using. Finally, you can reach me at Suzanne at thesuzannevenkershow.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. Have a great week.